welcome back to the Goldmark Gallery. We're 2 weeks now into our Henri Matisse exhibition. I think we've had some lovely comments about some of the fantastic printed work there in the main gallery room. It's all changed here at the moment at the gallery. You might hear a bit of noise behind me as we're moving exhibitions around after the extraordinary success of our Akiko Harai exhibition. There's lots of pots being moved around upstairs, things changing around. So everything's busy here at the gallery. But I thought I would show you something today which has a bit of a tie-in to those Matisse cutouts that we've seen recently in our Matisse exhibition. There's an interesting story to this suite of prints by Picasso, which were launched off the back of Matisse's cutouts. In November of 1954, Picasso was staying at his villa when he had news that in nearby Nice, an ailing Henri Matisse had finally passed away. Picasso was fond of saying, "Au fond, il n'y a que Matisse." When all's said and done, there's only Matisse. And now suddenly there was only Picasso. That afternoon, on a wintry day, he decided, in homage to the great Frenchman's last works, these enormous colour cutouts, to entertain his children one evening with cutout masks of animals and fawns and minotaurs, and play with these paper cutouts. Some years later, they would provide the basis for Picasso's sole commercial, sole graphic venture into photography, and that was the Diurnes suite, which I've got here in front of me. Diurnes was a collaborative effort between Pablo Picasso and a young photographer called André Villers. It takes its title from the Latin word diurnus, so by day or daytime, and it invoked the daily source of sunlight, which allowed both the photographer to capture his images on his negatives and also the painter to illuminate his canvases. So it was a kind of dual collaboration between artists and nature. And it was in this suite that some of the playful cutouts that Picasso had made with his children were combined with the photographic world to create these fantastic images. André Villers was only 23 when he first met Picasso. In 1953, there were 50 years between them. He was born in Beaucourt in 1930, and at a young age he'd suffered from tuberculosis, and his parents had sent him to Vallauris, where Picasso had his studio, his pottery, to recuperate. He had been suffering from decalcification in his bones, so he was sent there. He was very, very ill, practically unable to walk. It took him some time to recoup. He went there when he was 17. Some 5 or 6 years later, he had, as part of his therapy, taken long strolls into the town and enrolled in a photography course. And it was here, on a deserted street in Vallauris, that he met Picasso for the first time. Villers would end up becoming a hugely famous photographer, a portraitist of the great artists of the 20th century, people like Max Ernst, Chagall, Dali, Miro, but Picasso was to be his first. He approached the old man nervously with a camera clutched in his hands and asked if he might make a portrait. You'll probably have seen, as I've been flicking through some of these fantastic prints, that all the hallmarks of Picasso's imagery is here. In fact, this was one of very few times when Picasso himself actually played with photography. He had long been fascinated by the medium. From the early 1940s, he had been flirting with the camera in secret, making documentations of his own still lives, of the sculptures of his studio, which he would then use in his paintings. Then, in 1949, he was visited by the fantastic photographer Gjon Mili, an Albanian-American photographer who was taking portraits for Life magazine, and produced those wonderful, wonderful photographs of Picasso drawing on long exposure shot with a light torch. Those have become some of the most famous images of the artist. So he was very pleased to have met André Villers. He became a kind of a young acolyte, someone he could welcome into his world and sort of explore photography through Villers' own abilities with the camera. Before long, he gifted Villers with a camera, and he also invited him to his squat little villa, La Galloise, on the Chemin de Fauna in Valoris. Invited him into his studio to come and see what he could play with. Villers wrote about his time with Picasso later in his life, and he remembered how everything that Picasso touched, he somehow turned to art. Everything became a kind of prisoner to his creative ambitions. He remembers seeing the paintings strewn about the rooms. He described how every room that Picasso went into turned into a studio. It was cutouts like this fun, impish mask here that Picasso decided to show Villers. He said, play with these, see what you can make with them. And so Villers started to cut them around, move them about, sort of overlay them with other works. And suddenly, with this sort of puzzle cutting going on, Picasso apparently took on a serious air. He said, when I try to tell the truth, people take me for a fool, but I see you have understood me. And it was the start of what's to be a very fruitful, cooperative relationship over the next 10 years or so. One of Villers' traits as a photographer was his love of experimenting with work outside the camera, with light-sensitive paper and making his own negative film. And the Diurnes suite really grew out of that love of sort of exploration and playfulness. These images were made by taking some of those cutouts that Picasso had created and overlaying them onto light-sensitive paper, onto bromide paper, and then exposing them to the sun. Sometimes using multiple exposures, they could use more than one set of cutouts to overlay and to allow the sort of bleed through of natural textures of the world around them. Using these masks, these cutouts, these different figures and faces as a sort of way of mapping the wonderful Arcadian Provencal landscape around them. Part of what Picasso and Villers were trying to do together was to show that there was an immense beauty to the sort of humdrum aspects of the world around them, away from the sort of great cultural feats of man, away from the sort of braggadocio of larger, grander scale art projects. This was a kind of celebration of the wonderful natural textures of Provence, of crumbling brick walls, of dilapidation, of the dead leaves with their vines showing through. It was a wonderful account of the kind of the headiness and the sort of the rough around the edges places in this Provençal landscape. This was, in many ways, otherwise a very turbulent time in Picasso's life. His relationship with Françoise Gillot, with whom he had gone and visited Matisse and seen those cutouts, been so inspired at the time. Matisse was quite a hero for Gillot. They had split up, Gillot had left him, and he was now embarking on a new relationship with Jacqueline Roch. And in fact, you'll see her Roman profile in a number of these overlaid images later on. He was also sort of between studios. He'd practically abandoned his garret in Paris, and he was now sort of sequestered in the Côte d'Azur sun. And really, this was a time of both sort of incredible, prolific, creative fruitfulness and also frustration. He was a man possessed, and these difficulties in his private life, which were now playing out publicly, seemed to sort of catalyze something in him. He was a man driven by private frustration and an insatiable creative itch which no single project seemed able to scratch. I love the playfulness of some of these images, the simplicity of them, of the basic idea of simply overlaying the cutout over the real world, and in this way kind of finding this wonderful blend between recognizable textures, recognizable places and objects and things, and that fantastic childlike simplicity that Picasso brought to these cutout works. Picasso and Villers produced about 100 of these photograms, which they then whittled down to 30 for selection for this portfolio. And they were then translated lithographically and published by Berggruen in Paris in 1962. And really, throughout these images, you see all of the essential hallmarks of Picasso's work. His love of the theatrical mask. There's a little clown figure here. Lots of bull's heads, minotaurs. Often also centaurs and fawns. You'll even see in this print Picasso himself, or rather Picasso's forehead, being brought to play here. But it really matched that kind of Dionysian revelry, that enjoyment of the sort of wilder aspects of life. André Villers and Picasso basically set up two camps to produce these photograms. They went through the different cutouts and their various ideas at the Villa La Californie in Cannes, where Picasso's goat, Esmeralda, would wander around the unkempt garden, wander about amidst the sculptures that Picasso had dumped there. And then they would retreat to their dark room, which was in a separate location in Le Bleuduc, which was an abandoned mansion in Camargue, in the Camargue marshlands, from which, out of their shuttered windows, they could see the wild white Camargue horses and the black bulls being herded by their gardien. The lithographic translations of these photograms were eventually published in an edition of 1000, but for some reason it still remains a relatively unknown, untalked about chapter of Picasso's work, which is a shame because there's such a wonderful creative genius to this work, I think. It was a fantastic way to bring together the capabilities of Villers, his knowledge of how camera negatives could be exploited, and this wonderful playfulness between the very flat cutouts in their paper and this love of texture. There's so much texture going on in these different photographs, whether it's applied texture like these feathers, the pieces of lace, sometimes even the little grains of rice and things that are overlaid on this bromide paper, or whether it's the natural textures of the world around them. Some of these portraits of Jacqueline with this famous Roman profile are some of the nicest in the suite, I think. Picasso often said that it was only really out of struggle, out of difficulty, that great art could be made. And while I think that's a myth that doesn't always hold true, for Picasso it certainly seemed to. It was often in the most difficult periods of his life when he was challenged on all fronts. In this case, by the deterioration of his previous relationship and this blossoming new relationship with Jacqueline, with his increasing old age, the feeling that this sort of once lithe, powerful young body was slowly aging and he was not going to be able to create it with the same kind of speed and fervour that he used to. These different difficulties always seemed to combine, and this was such a prolific, such a profound period in his career. The Diurnes are just a little chapter in that, but I think they're a fascinating one. Really the only time, certainly in his printmaking, that we see him really playing with the photograph, really trying to get as much out of this new medium as he could. Something that he had paid little attention to in the first half of his career, as the camera seemed to dominate talk about art, but which returned now in this late period. Such a wonderful creative freedom, a simplicity on the one hand, and then this wonderful complexity that's brought in with this use of texture, with this overlapping, these sort of multiple layers of exposure. It's a really fantastic suite of prints that we've been very lucky to get our hands on. I hope you've enjoyed seeing it. An interesting stepping stone after those wonderful cutouts from Matisse. And I think a lovely and strangely unloved chapter from Picasso's life. I'm glad to have showed it to you today, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing some of these pictures.